Shavua Tov. Today's daf is daf Mem Tes, and we'll start here on daf Mem Ches Amud Beis, and we'll count up from the bottom of the Amud approximately 9 lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Ashkechan Shchita Bi'olo Lemitzvah. So far what we've proven is, based on various scriptural exegesis, is that an ola requires shchita lemitzvah in the tzafon. The tzafon is a requirement as a mitzvah. And Kabbalah nami lemitzvah ashkechan, we also derived the conclusion that the Kabbalah sadam has to be in the tzafon. And that's in the case of ola. But shchita v'kabbalah yakiv minolan, how do we know that if the shchita and the kabbalah was not done, shchita or the kabbalah was not done in the tzafon, the carbon is possible because tzafon is critical. Amarav Adu bar Ava v'itema Rabba bar Shila kal v'chomer. We're going to derive this conclusion from a kal v'chomer. Now, normally a kal v'chomer is not valid to derive Isurim and Onshim, Ein Onshim in Adin, maybe Isurim you could derive from Kal V'chomer, that's an issue, but here we're just deriving a psul korban in a case where he didn't do the Shechita or the Kabbalah in the Tzafon. And what's the Kal V'chomer? Uma chatas haba mikoach ola. The only reason we know that Tzafon is a requirement in chatas is because the Torah compares chatas to ola, but ola is the original, and that's the parasha of ola where the Torah requires tzafon. And yet ma'keves, with regard to chatos, if the carbon was shechted or the kabbalah sadam was not in the tzafon in the case of a chatos, then the carbon is possible, is ola sheba chatos mikocha, ola which is the original, and the only requirement that we derive regarding chatos and tzafon is only a derivative from ola, is Eino Din Shema Kevis. How much more so in the case of an ola, the requirement should be that much more critical. So the Gemara rejects this. If we find a special power and a chumrah, shall we say, in chatos, then the whole kal v'chomer falls off, because maybe the Torah was more machmir in chatos and required safon as a critical requirement, and that's not true for ola. And what makes chatos more profound and more severe than ola? The fact that it's mechaper even on chayve krisus, which means that if you violated a chiyuv karis b'shogeg, you bring a chatos. That's not true for an ola. An ola can't be mechaper on a violation of a chiyuv chatos, of a chiyuv kares. An ola could only be mechaper, let's say, on a bittul essay, if he didn't sit in the sukkah. Omar Avina, hakasha leila Rav Ada bar Ava, right? This was a kasha that already predated you, and it was difficult in the mind of Rav Ada bar Ava. Klum matzinu tafel chamer mina ikar. Is there any precedent, and that's going to be the balance of our sugya for today, where you derive y from x and the tafel, which is in this case, let's say, x, which is the malamed, is going to be tafel, and yet the derivation is going to end up with a chumrah. So, for example, in the case of ola, the Torah requires tzafon in the case of ola, and chatos by the Torah is compared to ola. So just like ola, where the Torah explicitly requires tzafon, so now we derive chatos. Now, are you going to tell me that because chatos has this special power that it's mechaper on kares, therefore it's more chamur in terms of the requirement of tzafon than ola? How could that be? I mean, the only reason we require tzafon in chatos is because the Torah compares it to ola. So it can't be that chatos would, in your havamina, would be more chamur than ola, in which case tzafon is critical in the case of achatos, but not in the case of ola. And now the Gemara is going to go through an entire sugya to try to see if sometimes we can have such a precedent where the derivative is more chomer than the original. And that's what the Gemara says. Omalei Mar Zutra Bereid Rav Mori Ravina Velo. Is this actually true? And here we start today's daf. Daf Mem Tes. Varei Maser Duhu Nifta, but Ilu Lakuach Bekesev Maser Eno Nifta. In the case of Maser Sheni, the Torah says that you could be podeit. So you can remove the Kedushas Maser Sheni by transferring and redeeming it onto Mos. But if he went ahead and took the Mos to Yerushalayim and he bought food stuff in Yerushalayim, then that food stuff that he bought from the money of Maser Sheni cannot be subject to pidyon. There's no pidyon. There's none. We learned in the Mishnah Masros, it says, Halakuach bekesef maser, that which you purchase in Yerushalayim from the money of Maser, shenitma, if it becomes tameh, then yipod. But Rabbi Yehuda says, yikaver. So Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion, and that's the main shita for us today, that in the case of lakuach b'maser sheni, even if it contracts tuma, it doesn't lend itself to pidyon. So therefore, we see that there's a chumrah in lakuach bekesef maser sheni that goes way beyond the original malame, the original maser sheni itself. Maser sheni itself lends itself to pidyon, but lakuach b'maser sheni does not. So the Gemara says the following: Nitma in, lo nitma lo. In other words, the only reason why the Torah recognizes the possibility of redeeming food stuff that was lakuach bekesef maser sheni is because it became tameh. If it hadn't become tameh, then it would be squared off, would be equal to the original, namely to maser sheni itself, and it would not be subject to pidyon. So hasam lo limi kedushasai lemitvas pidyone. So now the Gemara offers a different approach here and says the following. You know what? The fact that there's no pidyon in Maser Sheni, whereas there might be pidyon, at least in the case of Nitma, in Lakuach b'mas bekesef Maser Sheni, that is itself a reflection and is a result of the super chumrah of Maser Sheni that goes beyond the kedusha of lakuach v'maser sheni. The original is more stringent and more sanctified in a greater kedusha than that which is derived from the original. And the question of pidyon is a reflection of how profound the level of kedusha is. The greater the kedusha of the level, in this case Maser Sheni, because you now have the original Maser Sheni, the more difficult it is to be poda. You can't redeem that kedusha because it's so stringent. Masha ein kain. In the case of lakuach bekesef Maser Sheni, there the kedusha goes down a madrega, down a level, and now it lends itself to pidyon. Frek the Gemara very tmura. I'm going to prove to you that the original becomes less chomer than the derivative from the law of truma. Did I say that right? I meant to say that the derivative is more chomer than the original. That's what I meant to say anyway. The ilu kodshim lo chayli al bal mum kavua. Let's say you have an animal and you want to be magdish the animal. It's a behemas chulin, and the animal has a permanent mum. That's called a mum kavua, not something that'll pass with time. The din is that hegdesh on a bal mum cannot be tofes, and yet v'ilu I chayli. But let's say a tmura in which you substitute the kedusha of the original korban and you try, at least attempt to transfer it over to the Bei Maschulin through the process of Tmura. So the Tmura's Kedusha is a reflection of the original. And yet, there's something very strange over here. That the Kedusha of Tmura Bichal, even though the animal is a Palmum, how could that be? Tmura is a secondary derivative of the original Kedusha's carbon. How could it be Chal on a Palmum when the original Kedusha's carbon, if you were Magdish and it's a Palmum, would not even be Tofis, it wouldn't be Chal? And the Gemara answers, Tmura mikah kodshim ka asya, v'kodshim mikah chulin ka asya. It works like this, says the Gemara. Again, it's a very profound sugya. Later on, we're going to have a sugya with technicalities of how to derive and scriptural exegesis. It gets very, very technical. But this, at least, is something that's conceptually fundamental. The Gemara is saying the following. Where does the Kedusha of Hegdesh, before you do the Tmura, where does it come from? And the Kedusha of the Tmura, where does it come from? So we're saying the following, that when you're Magdish the animal, you start with the Behemas Chulin. You were able to be Magdish the Behemas Chulin, but only if it's not a Balmum. It's got to be a Tomim. So that indicates how severe the Kedusha is. When we get to Tmura, then we're going to reduce the level of Kedusha because that's already a Behemas Chulin that's derived from a Kedusha, which in itself is derived from a Behemas Chulin. So the Tmura is on a lower level, and therefore that Hegdesh of Tmura could be Chal even on a Palmum. Frekta Gemara, again against Rav Barava, Hare Pesach, to who ain't aton smicha nisachim utnufas chazav shot. A lamb that was sanctified as a carbon Pesach is outside of the purview of three major requirements. Number one, you don't need smicha. Number two, you don't need nesachim to accompany the carbon Pesach. And number three, there's no tnufas chazav shot. And yet, ilu mosar dite, let's say your carbon Pesach that you designated got lost. In the meantime, you designated a replacement carbon Pesach. And now you find the original carbon Pesach. So the one that you designated as a replacement, that's called Mosar HaPesach. Now, what's the law of Mosar HaPesach? Ton, Smicha, Nesachim, Trufas HaDvishok. All these requirements in the Avod of carbon Pesach are dropped. That are dropped in the Avod of carbon Pesach now resuscitate themselves in the case of Mosar Pesach. Now, how could it be? How could we be more machmir in the Mosar Pesach, which is only a substitute for the original? And the original itself does not generate those three mitzvahs. The Gemara says, no, you're making a mistake. You think that Mosar Pesach is a carbon Pesach, and therefore we should compare it to the original carbon Pesach? No, it's b'shayvos shlamimu. It's a carbon shlamim. Once we pass Yudalid ben Nisan, that behema becomes a shlamim, and a shlamim lends itself to smicha nesachim echazal yisham. Okay, now at this point, the Gemara reverts back to the original question of tzafon. How do we know that tzafon is critical? It's an absolute requirement, both regarding the shechita and regarding the Kabbalah's dam in the case of an ola. And the Gemara tried to prove this, if you recall, from a Kal V'chomer from Chatos, because in Chatos, tzafon is likuva, and yet Chatos itself is a derivative of Ola, where it says explicitly that you require tzafon. And now we're saying that since Chatos is likuva, and Chatos is only a derivative, how much more so Ola, the original, is likuva. It's absolutely critical that he does it in tzafon. Ibay Seima, the Gemara says, you know what? Put this Kal V'chomer on the side. I have an alternative approach. And that is, Omakra, the Pasuk says, Ha-Ola. And what do we derive from the pasuk ha'ola? And this is in Vayikra Perek Dalid, and the Torah says, "V'samach yodo al rosh hachatos v'shachet es hachatos b'makom ha'ola," with a hey yediyah, and b'mkoma tehei. That means b'mkoma, in that location in the Azor, namely the Tzofan, that's where you have to perform the shchita and the kabbalah sadam of a korban olah. And that is a repetition of what we already know in the case of korban olah. You need safon in the northern part. So if the Torah repeats itself, that itself is likuva. Now the Gemara says, what about a korban asham? Asham minol and devoid safon. Right, we said that kodesh kodeshim straight across the board required safon. And what about asham? And the Gemara says, "Dichsiv b'makom asher yishchetu es ha'olah yishchetu es ha'asham." The Torah identifies the location for the shechita of the asham as that of the location for the shechita of the olah. Ashkan shechita kabbalah minolan. How do you know that kabbalah in the case of an asham requires safon? And the Gemara answers, "Es damo yizrog." Right, we had a pasuk that we mentioned before, and it says, "B'makom asher," this is in Vayikra Zayin, "B'makom asher yishchetu es ha'olah yishchetu es ha'asham v'es damo yizrok al mezbeach saviv." Right, so if you emphasize the word v'es damo, those two words, and the Torah says that they require zrikas adam, and again, it's b'makom asher yishchetu es ha'olah, so the asham requires the same location as the shechita of the ola, which means it requires tzafon, is kibul damu nami b'tzafon. Oh, now the Gemara wants to differentiate between the chefta of the animal and the gavra of the kohen. Mekabel atzo minolan. Okay, let's say that the gavra of the kohen who's doing the kabbalah sadam, he is located, his feet are firmly grounded outside the tzafon, and he stretches his arm into the tzafon in order to be makabel the dam. And the Gemara answers, "Domo vs domo." Why does it have to say vs domo? It could have just said domo. And the extra word s is coming to teach you that the Kohen has to be located inside the tzafon when he's makabel dam. And the truth is that this pasuk is totally dedicated to the Kohen itself. He's describing the requirements of the Kohen. Makom asher yishchetu sa'ola, yishchetu sa'asham ve'ezdomo. So we're talking about ezdomo, not the shechita of the kabbalah sadam, and we're talking about the Kohen and where he's located. Right, we now need, in the case of an asham, a repetition, which is called Shino Olav HaKosuf, of the requirement of tzafon in order to make tzafon into a critical requirement that's indispensable with regard to the korban asham, and that's tzafon. And the Gemara answers, Krach we have another pasuk, and this pasuk is in Vayikra Zayin, V'shachat es hakeves, which literally means he should slaughter the lamb. Okay, v'shachat es hakeves. The next part of the pasuk is b'makom asher yishchat es hachatos v'es ha'olah. Is makom hakodesh ki kechatos ha'osham hu lakoin kodesh kadoshim hu. So the Torah in Vayikra Perek Zayin already indicates to us that the asham has to be subject to a shechita and a kabbalah in the tzafon. And now we have repetition in the pasuk in Vayikra Dalit. No, I'm sorry, in Vayikra Zayin, but this time it's Pasuk Beis as opposed to Pasuk Yud Zayin, Yud Gimel, I'm sorry, Yud Gimel. And therefore, now that we have two psukim, both of which teach us that Asham requires tzafon, we can now derive the conclusion that what? That tzafon is likuva is critical in the case of a korban Asham. Frekta Gemara, v'hai lahachi asa. Is that pasuk coming to teach us that? Homi boilech chasanya, I need it for a brisa. Okay, Rabbosai, now we're getting into the heavy, heavy issues of Rabbi Shmuel's rules and regulations of HaTorah Nidreshes B'hem, how to derive an exegesis from the Torah. And the Brisa says the following: Davar shahya b'chalal, v'yotza lidon b'davar chadosh, i'ata rashay lachzir l'klolo, ad sheyachzirenu ha'kosev l'klolo b'ferish. Okay, we'll explain this through the example that the Gemara is going to, that the Brisa is going to give. Ketzad. Give me an example of this very sophisticated and abstract rule. It says, "V'shachat es hakeves." This is Vayikra Yudalit. V'mokom asher yishchat es hachatos. V'es ha'ola. Etc., etc. And then it says, "Ki kechatos ha'osham hu." So this pasuk is referring to a korban osham. And the Torah says that the shechita of the lamb, which is an osham, should be executed in the same location where you shecht a chatos and an olah. Now, what's going on over here? The Torah adds not only es hachatos, but also es ha'olah. Now, why did the Torah need to compare the Osham to both Chatos and Ola? Well, what do we need that for? I don't need Kechatos ha'osham. Why do you add Kechatos ha'osham? Why don't you go straight to the gurgle, to the neck, and compare Osham to Ola? Ola, after all, is the original parsha that requires this avoda b'tzafon. So why not just go straight line, right? The shortest distance to 2 points is a straight line, right? So go from Asham to Ola. Why this middle step of kechatos? Okay, so now the Brisa is going to introduce that which is very unique to a korban Asham. The parish of Asham is the parish of Asham Mitzora. And the dam of the Asham Mitzora requires a special hazoya in 3 different locations on the body of the Mitzora as part of the process of purification. So that takes Asham and its dam out of the entire constellation of Kodshim, of Karbonos. Lefisha Yotza Asham Mitzora Lidon V'Dover Chodesh. That's the key phrase here. Dover Chodesh is a very unique and a deviation of all that we know in Dam Kodshim. That what? What's that Dover Chodesh? But Bo and Yad, Bo and Regel, V'Ozen Yimos. These are the 3 places in the body. The right thumb and the big toe and the ear of the Mitzora, all these require a Hazoyas Dam, and that's called the Dover Chodesh. That only applies to Hasham Mitzora. And therefore, Yochel, I might think, Lo Yeiton Matan Domim Ve'Murim L'Gabi Mizbeach. Maybe since the whole mechanism of Hasham Mitzora is radically different than every, so we're not really interested in the Dam for Hakrov Al Gabi Mizbeach. Right in the Dam, the Nesinas Dam, the Rikas Dam is always matir. The Emurim for Haktor Al Gabi Mizbeach. Here, maybe we don't need that. The whole thing is out the window. Why? Because what's the purpose of the Matan Domim here? It's the Hazoya on the Gufo shell. And it's not for the purpose of kapar, it's for the purpose of Tara. So maybe the Torah would relieve the requirement of Haktoras Heimurim that you have to take the emurim, the fats and so forth and so on of the carbon, in this case carbon asham, and burn it on the mizbech. Maybe we don't have that requirement. Is Talmud Lomer kechatos ha'asham hu ma chatos te'unamat domim ve'emurim legabi mizbeach. So it's not enough in the case of a chatos to take the dam and do whatever you want with it. I don't know. But rather, you have two functions of the dam. Number one, it needs zrika al gabi mizbech, and number two, once the zrika was done, it's matir the emurim for haktor al gabi mizbeach is af asham mitzora, despite the fact that asham mitzora is a davar chadash, and it sort of left the klal of all korbanos with its own unique dinim in requirements in the dam is ton matan dom ve'emurim l'gam mizbeach, because the Torah went out of its way to equate the asham with the chatos in order to teach us that the asham, despite the fact that it's a davar chadash, nevertheless it requires not only shchita and kabbalah b'tzafon, but also requires that the dam should be thrown onto the mizbeach, and that will be matir the boss of haktor al gabi mizbeach. So at this point, the Gemara thinks that there's no shino lov hakosav over here. The whole point to establishing that safon in a carbon asham was likuva, was absolutely essential, was because the Torah unnecessarily repeated it. But now we're saying that it wasn't, pardon the double negative, it wasn't unnecessary to repeat it. It was necessary to repeat it. Why? Because we needed, first of all, to tell us about haktoras, the zrikas adam al gabi mizbeach, and haktoras haimurim al gabi mizbeach. And now it's going to tell me about safon. But there's no repetition of tzafon, because the equation between asham and chatos is not related to the issue of tzafon, but rather related to the issue of zrika al gabi mizrikas adam and haktor saimur. So the Gemara says in Cain, if you're telling me that the Torah has to tell us that an asham like a chatos and like an ola requires tzafon, but that we require and we only have it once, is nichtov bahai v'lo nichtov bahai. In other words, we could derive the halacha of tzafon from the mitzora and his asham so now you have to keep in mind, the Gemara now is going back to Perek Zayin. Right? In Perek Zayin, we have this general rule that all the korbanos that are kodshi kodshim required tzafon. So that was a pasuk in Vayikra Zayin. So Gemara is saying, lo nichtov bahai. Why couldn't the Torah just drop the ball, omit that pasuk? And if you want to know how do we require, from whence do we derive the conclusion that a kodshei kodshim requires tzafon, that we're going to derive from Asham Mitzora. And we're going to take Asham Mitzora, which the Torah went out of its way to compare it to Chatos and Asham, to require what? To require tzafon. And we're going to use that for what? For a general rule that includes all karbanos asham, despite the fact that they don't have that davar chadash of bohen, yodo, and raglo, and so forth. But the Torah is going out of its way to give us a general rule requiring tzafon in the case of all ashamos. And if the Torah had done that, then we would derive the requirement of tzafon in the case of an asham mitzora from the fact that the asham mitzora is included in that membership club of ashamos. So why did the Torah have to repeat itself with regard to tzafon? Why not derive tzafon in carbon asham from that other pasuk in Vayikra Zayin, which has a general rule derived from asham for all hashamos, derived from mitzora to all hashamos? And the answer must be that the Torah had to go out of its way to repeat Safon in this case in order to apply the principle of Shina Lava Kosav Liake, to teach me that it's crucial. Gemara says, okay, now we get again back on the horse of the rules of Rabbi Shmuel that govern exegesis. Ha-nicha, everything that you say is wonderful, that we can derive from the unnecessary repetition of Safon in the case of Asham Mitzora, that the Torah repeated itself to teach us that Safon is Likuva. That makes sense if you hold Yatza Lidin. Yatza Lidon, sorry. B'davar HaChadash Ihu Hu Delo Gomer Michlolo. Meaning that Asham Mitzora, as the exception to the rule that has a Davar Chadash, it itself could no longer be used to derive by analogy any other similar cases.